Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I wasn't planning to go to Jessica's wedding. Honestly, I thought she'd eloped already and the whole thing would just pop up on Facebook with a set of heavily filtered photos, a half-naked beach minister, and one of those captions about finding peace in the arms of your soulmate. But instead, it came in the mail, a thick envelope, off-white with gold foil letters that spelled out her full name like a royal decree. Jessica Ann Whitmore requests the honor of your presence. And beneath the fancy fonts, there it was, my name, handwritten in black ink, and a sticky note pressed gently to the edge of the RSVP card that read, "Hope you can wear something appropriate." I read it twice, then a third time. I sat down on my couch and stared at it like it was a trap. Appropriate. Not comfortable, not whatever makes you feel beautiful, but appropriate. And the wink? That smug little curl of ink practically screamed, "I still think I'm better than you." And here I was, 36 years old, still catching backhanded jabs from a girl who used to steal my clothes and lie about it with tears in her eyes. The last time I saw Jessica in person, I'd just come back from Afghanistan. My second tour. My hair was shorter, my eyes heavier, and my patience paper thin. Our mom cried at the airport. But Jessica stood stiff with her arms crossed like I'd just gotten back from a vacation I never invited her on. She hugged me like someone greeting a coworker they barely tolerate. And when Mom asked if I'd share some funny stories from overseas, Jessica added, "Maybe skip the blood and trauma, we're about to eat." That was 8 years ago. We never really talked after that. I put the invitation on my fridge, partly out of habit, partly because I didn't want it on my counter. For a week, it hung there next to a magnet that read, "My dog and I talk shit about you." I was fully prepared to ignore it until Mom called me and said, "Emily, it would mean a lot to your sister if you came. She's really worked hard on this day. Worked hard. As if she didn't have a wedding planner, a full-on Pinterest board, and a fiancé who probably ironed his socks." I bit my tongue and said I'd think about it, which, to be fair, was already more than Jessica had probably expected. The next morning, I found myself looking at flights, and by evening, I'd booked a seat on the red-eye to Richmond. I told myself it was for Mom, that she deserved to have both daughters under the same roof without needing sedatives. But if I'm honest, and I'm trying to be honest here, I think I went because of that damn note, that wink, that implication that no matter what I did, I'd always be the disappointment in combat boots. And maybe, deep down, I just wanted to see her squirm. The day I landed, I walked into the house I grew up in, and it smelled the same, like lemon cleaner, cheap potpourri, and the faint whiff of unresolved tension. Mom hugged me tight and stepped back with watery eyes. She whispered, "You look good, baby, tired, but good." And Jessica? She glanced up from her phone and said, "Wow, you still cut your own hair?" We were 36 and 32, but she still knew how to land a punch without raising her voice. Dinner that night was like a play that never ends. Mom talked too much to cover the silences, and Jessica's fiancé, Daniel, tried too hard to seem interested in my life. I didn't hold it against him. He didn't know. He didn't grow up watching Jessica stage cry her way out of trouble or throw tantrums that led to my grounding. He hadn't seen the way she'd twist a situation so tight around her finger that truth would snap before she'd ever admit fault. At one point, Jessica leaned over her salad and said, "By the way, Em, white's off limits, obviously. We're keeping it traditional and, well," she smiled sweetly. "You know," she didn't say it, she didn't have to, "you're not pure." The words hung in the room like smoke. Daniel looked confused. Mom looked down at her plate and I just nodded. I smiled like it was a joke, like she hadn't just dressed me in shame in front of everyone with a single sentence. I took a sip of wine and said, "Of course. Wouldn't dream of stealing your thunder." That night in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly and thought about the version of myself they all seemed to remember. The girl who got drunk at prom and missed curfew. The girl who enlisted at 19 and didn't send postcards. The girl who came home with scars no one wanted to see. To them, I was always going to be that girl. Not the woman who'd carried bleeding bodies across sand, not the one who'd stood through mortar fire and told herself not to cry until it was over. To them, purity meant never making a mistake, never falling, never bleeding. And I'd done all three. Around midnight, I went into Jessica's old room, mostly to see if she'd redecorated or erased herself like she used to erase me from family albums she rearranged in her own little shrine. But no, it was still pink and pristine, like a Barbie showroom that refused to age. On a high shelf in the closet behind a row of shoeboxes, I found something unexpected. A small wooden box with her initials burned into the top. Inside, a stack of old letters tied with ribbon, a dried-out rose, and a small plastic bag containing a pregnancy test. Positive, and a folded paper beneath it, stained with water damage but still readable. Ryan, please don't call again. I can't deal with this now. My parents would kill me. I stared at it for a long time, and for once I didn't feel angry. I felt heavy, not from judgment, not from revenge, but from the sheer weight of how many lies we'd all been living with. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't the only one pretending to be something I wasn't, but the difference? I had nothing left to lose. So when she told me not to wear white because I wasn't pure, she had no idea how far from the truth her little fantasy was. And that's when I decided, if she wanted traditional, I'd give her something unforgettable instead. The morning sun had barely filtered through the thin curtains when I woke up in that old guest room that somehow still smelled faintly of dust and lavender, like time had passed everywhere except inside those four walls. My back ached from the too soft mattress, and my jaw was sore from clenching it in my sleep. I rolled onto my side, eyes landing on the wooden box I had found the night before. Jessica's box of secrets, tucked away like a dirty stain under a white dress. I hadn't opened it again since the night before, but it sat on the dresser like it had something to say, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to listen. But I knew one thing: my sister's life, the perfect bride fantasy she paraded around, wasn't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe, and maybe that meant I wasn't the only liar in the family after all. I took a long shower, letting the water burn just enough to wake me up fully. While I stood there under the spray, I kept thinking about that name, Ryan. It had been scrawled in sharp, messy handwriting, the kind that looked rushed or scared or both. I vaguely remembered him. He'd been Jessica's college boyfriend back when she went through her artsy phase, the same time she wore combat boots with dresses and pretended to like folk music. I hadn't thought about him in years, and even then, I only ever heard his name whispered during family dinners, when Dad would ask if that boy with the guitar had finally found a job. After dressing and dodging the awkwardness of breakfast, where Mom tried to push eggs on me like it was some kind of olive branch, I grabbed my phone and did a quick social media search for Ryan. His last name was unique enough to narrow it down, and within minutes, I had found him. His profile was private, of course, but his profile picture gave away enough. Same soft eyes, same messy hair, but now he was holding a toddler on his hip and smiling like a man who'd figured things out, or at least had learned to fake it. I stared at the photo for a while before hitting message. I didn't overthink it. I simply typed, "Hey, this is Emily, Jessica's sister. I found something I think you should know about. Can we talk?" I sent it and tossed the phone onto the bed, half hoping he wouldn't reply, half hoping he would immediately. He didn't, not at first. So I went downstairs, made a cup of black coffee, and sat on the porch while Jessica flitted around inside the house like a deranged butterfly, checking table arrangements, texting vendors, and barking at Mom about the playlist, not including enough clean songs. She came outside at one point, holding a clipboard like she was running a damn military operation. She looked at me over the rim of her sunglasses and said, "Hey, just a reminder, no white at the rehearsal dinner either. The photographers will be there, and I just want to keep things coordinated." I took a slow sip of my coffee, held her gaze, and said, "I'll wear beige. Wouldn't want to pollute the color scheme with my impurity." She blinked, unsure if I was joking, and then gave that fake little laugh she always used when she didn't know if she was being insulted. "You're funny," she said, then turned and walked back inside like she had a crown to polish. I hated how easy it was for her to dismiss things, to brush everything off with a laugh and a flick of her wrist, like none of it ever stuck to her, like she'd never bled or begged or made mistakes. But I had the proof now, didn't I? That box upstairs was like a loaded gun, and I was the only one who knew how to use it. It was around 2 in the afternoon when Ryan finally replied. His message was short, just a question. "What did you find?" I told him the truth about the test, the letter, the fact that she had hidden a pregnancy during their relationship. I offered to meet him that evening, away from the house, just to talk. He agreed, and we picked a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee is bad, but the booths offer privacy. When I walked in, he was already there, looking older but not unrecognizable. He stood when he saw me, unsure whether to smile or not. I sat down across from him, and for a minute, we just stared at each other like strangers trying to find familiarity in shared history. Finally, I slid the photos I'd taken of the note and the test across the table. He stared at them for a long time, then leaned back, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to hold in 20 years of confusion. "She never told me," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "She just ghosted me. I thought maybe I had screwed up, that I'd done something wrong." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked up at me with eyes that weren't angry, but stunned. "Why are you showing me this now?" I didn't really have an answer that didn't sound petty or cruel, but I told him the truth. Because she told me I couldn't wear white, said I wasn't pure, and I just thought, maybe someone should remind her she's not the Virgin Mary either. Ryan let out a soft laugh, not out of humor, but disbelief. She always did love playing the innocent one. We sat in silence for a bit. I told him I wasn't going to do anything with it, not unless I had to. I wasn't looking to blow up her life. I wasn't that heartless. But I also wasn't going to let her humiliate me again in front of 100 guests, with a smile on her face and a knife under her tongue. He said he understood, and before we left, he asked one final question. "Why did you come back, really?" I paused. Because she expected me not to. Because they all did. I went back to the house that night, calmer than I'd felt in years. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with the information I had. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to disappear into the background like I always had. And if Jessica wanted a perfect wedding, she was going to have to do it standing next to the truth. Even if it stood silently in a military uniform at the edge of the crowd. Sometimes silence says everything. The morning of the wedding began with a headache. Not the kind that throbs behind your temples like a hangover, but the kind that starts deep behind your eyes and spreads outward like a pressure system moving through your skull. I had barely slept the night before, kept awake by the weight of everything I knew and everything I was trying not to do with it. The house was already bustling with hairstylists and makeup artists by the time I came downstairs. Each of them tiptoeing around Jessica like she was made of glass and rage, laughing too hard at her jokes, and nodding with the kind of terrified energy usually reserved for hostage situations. The smell of hairspray, perfume, and freshly baked catering trays filled the air, making it difficult to breathe without tasting the artificial sweetness of someone else's fantasy. Jessica didn't look at me right away when I entered the room, probably assuming I'd taken the hint and quietly disappeared sometime during the night. But when I stepped into the kitchen to grab coffee in my old army t-shirt and sweatpants, her head snapped up with that deer-in-headlights expression she always wore when I appeared in places she didn't want me. Her mouth twitched slightly, half smile, half sneer, and she said, "Oh good, you're still here. I thought maybe you'd left without saying anything." I smiled and replied, "Tempting, but I figured if I was going to ruin your big day, I should do it in person." It was the kind of joke that made everyone else in the room stop laughing immediately, unsure of which sister they were supposed to agree with. Jessica rolled her eyes and turned her attention back to her curling iron, but I caught the way her hand trembled slightly, just for a second. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. I spent the morning in the background, watching her float from room to room like a queen, overseeing her coronation. Everyone complimented her, everyone adored her, and no one questioned her, not even our mother, who hovered near her like a satellite desperate to stay in orbit. Meanwhile, I was just a decorative inconvenience, a seat filler with too much history and not enough tact to be paraded around like a show pony. I was the uncomfortable truth wrapped in combat boots and emotional scar tissue, and they were all hoping I'd stay silent, nod politely, and fade into the wallpaper like the shame no one wanted to acknowledge. Around noon, Jessica pulled me aside into the hallway, her makeup half done and her voice low but sharp. Listen, I'm going to say this once and only once. Don't make this about you. Don't wear white, don't give speeches, don't even breathe too loudly. Today is not the day to remind people you exist, Emily. I nodded calmly, pretending to agree, pretending to submit like I always had when we were younger and she'd whisper insults under her breath when our parents weren't looking. She smiled, satisfied that she'd delivered her warning, and turned back toward her room with the confidence of someone who truly believed she'd won something. But she had no idea that, just the night before, I had already picked out exactly what I'd be wearing. And it wasn't beige. After she disappeared down the hallway, I went back up to the guest room and quietly opened the garment bag I'd hidden in the back of the closet behind an old trunk of Dad's fishing gear. Inside was my full military dress uniform, freshly cleaned and pressed, with every medal and pin exactly where it should be. The blues were deep and sharp, the shoes polished to a mirror shine, and the brass buttons caught the light like small, deliberate spotlights. I ran my fingers over the stitching, over the ribbons that represented things no one in this house had ever asked me about, and I took a deep breath before beginning to change. As I got dressed, I thought about the absurdity of what this day was supposed to mean. Jessica, the pure bride, walking down the aisle in a dress the color of perfection, pretending she had never once bled or sinned or lied. The white fabric was a costume, a symbol for a life she had never really lived, but desperately wanted everyone to believe in. Meanwhile, I was the one who had sacrificed, who had served, who had seen people die, and lived through my own kind of war. And yet I was the one told to hide in beige because I wasn't fit for the fantasy. I pinned my medals with precision: Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal with Valor, Purple Heart, each one placed carefully, a piece of a life that had been forged in fire and grit, not in floral arrangements and cake tastings. When I stepped back and looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see a rebel or a troublemaker. I saw a soldier, a woman, someone who had earned the right to stand wherever the hell she pleased. I left the room just as the guests were arriving, the murmur of small talk and clinking glasses drifting through the house like static. The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, and Jessica was hidden away in a side room with her bridesmaids, laughing too loudly at something that probably wasn't funny. I slipped into the main hall quietly, taking my place at the back so no one could say I had tried to steal the spotlight. But when I entered, the reaction was immediate. The room fell silent. One by one, heads turned toward me, eyes widening as they took in the dark navy uniform, the sharp lines, the medals glinting against my chest. The photographer, clearly confused, lowered his camera slightly, unsure if this was a moment he was supposed to capture or pretend hadn't happened. The groom's family stared like they'd just seen a ghost or a scandal walking upright. And my father, who had spent most of my adult life pretending my career was a phase, looked down at his shoes like they'd suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. I walked slowly down the side aisle, not toward the front, but toward an empty chair near the middle, making eye contact with no one and everyone at the same time. I could feel the heat of their judgment, their confusion, their discomfort. It washed over me like a familiar kind of weather, cold, heavy, and utterly survivable. I sat down, crossed my legs, and folded my hands in my lap. No apologies, no explanations, just presence. And for the first time in years, I felt exactly where I was meant to be. From behind the door at the front of the chapel, Jessica's laughter floated through again, still oblivious, still perfect, but not for long. The first few moments after I sat down in that stiff white folding chair were soaked in a silence so loud it practically echoed, the kind that makes even the shallowest breath feel like an interruption. It was the kind of stillness that only happens when someone shows up dressed for a different kind of ceremony, one not built on roses and rings, but on rules and rank. I could feel the eyes on me before I even looked up. Some narrowed with confusion, others widened with alarm, but most settled somewhere between disapproval and disbelief. Like my presence had turned their little fairy tale into a courtroom drama without warning. The organist, seated just beside the flower-laced altar, stopped playing mid-chord, fingers frozen in the air like she'd been struck with temporary paralysis. No one said a word. No one needed to. The air itself had thickened, clogged with the kind of tension that feels like it might snap if someone so much as coughs. I didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't give them anything to hang on to. I simply adjusted my metals because one of them had shifted slightly when I sat down, and looked straight ahead as though I belonged there more than any of them, because deep down, I knew I did. I had walked into a place where my existence was considered a disruption, and I had done it on purpose. Not to ruin a wedding, not to start a fight, but to finally stop apologizing for who I was and what I had survived. There's a strange kind of peace in knowing the worst thing they can think about you is already something they've believed for years. You stop fearing judgment once you've been misjudged enough times. The door at the front of the chapel creaked open, and Jessica stepped out in full bridal regalia, her white dress practically glowing under the flood of sunlight from the stained glass windows. She was smiling, wide, serene, confident, as she linked arms with our father and began the slow, traditional walk down the aisle. Her bouquet was a perfect ball of pale roses. Her veil fell like mist over her shoulders, and every inch of her presentation screamed purity, elegance, control. But what struck me most wasn't her appearance. It was the fact that she hadn't looked left or right. She was too rehearsed, too focused on the fantasy she'd spent months choreographing to notice the fracture sitting 10 rows deep in her performance. It wasn't until she was halfway down the aisle that she saw me. It happened in slow motion, the way her eyes flickered toward my row, the way her chin tilted, ever so slightly, as if her brain couldn't quite register what it was seeing. Her smile faltered, a tiny slip of composure that most people would miss, but I caught it. Her steps didn't stop. Her body didn't turn, but her expression shifted just enough to crack the porcelain mask she wore. I held her gaze, steady and unapologetic, and for that brief instant, it was just the two of us again, sisters locked in an old, bitter silence that had followed us from childhood like a second shadow. When she reached the altar, the officiant began his opening lines, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to recover the room's rhythm. Jessica looked forward again, chin high, but her shoulders were tighter now, her grip on the bouquet a little too firm. I wondered how much she had guessed already, whether she thought this was some twisted form of protest, or whether she understood that I wasn't here to disrupt her vows, but to survive them with my dignity intact. The ceremony went on, every word of it sounding like it had been plucked from a greeting card, promises about forever, declarations of love, acknowledgments of fate. Jessica and Daniel repeated each line with perfect cadence, each syllable laced with practiced joy. I watched without blinking, without fidgeting, and with each passing minute, I felt less like an intruder and more like a mirror she couldn't escape. Every time she looked at her groom, every time she glanced at the crowd, I could see her trying not to look at me, trying not to remember the box hidden in her closet, or the name scribbled on that water-stained note that I still kept in my coat pocket, like a moral compass turned due south. It wasn't until the reception that everything truly began to unravel. The ballroom was lit like a movie set, chandeliers glowing, champagne flowing, and waiters dressed like tuxedoed ghosts drifting silently between tables. The music was loud, the laughter louder, and the bride was back in control, making her rounds with that calculated grace she had perfected over the years. I stayed near the back of the room, not hiding, but not exactly mingling either. Every now and then, someone would approach me, usually someone from the groom's side, asking polite questions about my service, feigning interest like they were trying to figure out if I was part of some elaborate surprise. Then the toasts began. The best man told a story about Daniel's first date with Jessica, how he had spilled wine on his pants and tried to pretend it was intentional. There was laughter, warm and easy, the kind that made people lean in and smile like they were part of something permanent. The maid of honor followed, talking about how Jessica had always known what she wanted, how she had been planning her wedding since the 4th grade. More laughter, more clinking glasses, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, Jessica stood and called out my name. "Emily," she said, her voice sweet and wide-eyed, like the trap it was. "Don't you have a toast for us? After all, you made such a memorable entrance." A few people chuckled. Most turned their heads toward me, eager for another surprise, another twist in the story. I stood slowly, every inch of me screaming to sit back down, to stay quiet, to avoid becoming the villain in a room where I'd never been allowed to be the hero. But I didn't sit. I didn't stay quiet. I picked up my glass of water, no champagne, no alcohol, just plain, simple water, and I walked to the microphone. I stood in front of a crowd that wasn't mine, beside a woman who had always written me out of her script, and I spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. To Jessica and Daniel, I began, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to make people lean forward. May your marriage be built on honesty, on forgiveness, and on the ability to look at each other even when the truth is inconvenient. I paused. Because purity isn't a color, it's not a dress, it's not a lie we wear because it photographs well. I looked directly at Jessica. It's the courage to live with the things we've done and still choose to love ourselves anyway. There was no applause. There was no gasp. Just silence, thick and undeniable, stretching across the room like a curtain about to fall. And then, as if the universe itself had a flair for timing, the doors to the ballroom creaked open, and Ryan walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there. We had agreed on that. But maybe he needed his own kind of closure. Maybe he needed to see the fantasy for what it really was. Jessica turned white, paler than the dress she wore. Daniel stood slowly, confusion scribbled across his face like a riddle he couldn't solve. And me, I stepped away from the microphone, handed off my glass, and walked back to my seat with my head held high. This was no longer about a wedding. This was about what happens when the truth finally walks into the room and refuses to leave. The sound that followed Ryan's entrance wasn't immediate chaos, nor was it the kind of loud, cinematic explosion of gasps and clattering glasses you'd expect from a moment this pregnant with tension. It was far more unsettling than that. What filled the room was an eerie, echoing quiet that only deepened as people turned their heads one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Each guest's gaze drawn toward the doorway where he stood, awkward and clearly unsure if he should take another step or just disappear. He looked older than I remembered him from the night before, like the weight of knowing had settled hard across his shoulders overnight, dragging down not only his posture, but the expression on his face, which hovered somewhere between disbelief and regret. Jessica, standing frozen in the center of the ballroom beneath an extravagant chandelier, stared at him with wide eyes that blinked too slowly, her knuckles whitening around her bouquet, as if she could will this man, and everything he represented, back into the past just by gripping something tightly enough. Daniel, poor clueless Daniel, turned toward his bride with a frown that didn't yet contain anger, only confusion, the kind that cuts in with a creeping chill rather than a slap. He looked from Ryan to Jessica, back and forth like he was waiting for someone to say, this was all just a strange coincidence, or a forgotten college friend stopping by with a bottle of champagne, and no sense of timing. But no one said anything, and in that breathless, stretching silence, something else filled the space. Understanding, quiet and brutal, settling on the shoulders of those who noticed too much and said too little. The music had stopped, the laughter had evaporated, and all that remained was the kind of hush reserved for hospital waiting rooms and courtroom verdicts. Jessica, to her credit, didn't collapse or cry or flee the room in dramatic fashion. Instead, she turned slowly, placed her bouquet down on the nearest table with the kind of precision that bordered on surgical, and walked, deliberately, almost calmly, toward Ryan. For a moment, I wondered if she was going to hug him, to somehow spin this into a spontaneous reconnection with an old friend that meant absolutely nothing at all. But when she reached him, she simply looked up into his face with an expression that was almost blank, as if she were waiting for him to deliver her fate instead of fighting for it herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, and her voice wasn't angry or afraid. It was flat, so devoid of emotion that it somehow made the room colder. Ryan didn't answer right away. He glanced toward me, and I didn't move. I wasn't going to save her, not from this, not anymore. I had done enough protecting in my lifetime. Protected the family from my pain, protected my parents from the truth about their favoritism, protected my sister from ever having to confront the consequences of the lies she spun like silk. Not today. "I thought you'd want to know I got the message," he finally said, his voice soft enough that only the people nearest him could hear, but the ripple of tension it caused spread fast. "And I thought maybe he deserved to know too." He looked at Daniel as he said it, and I saw the color drain from the groom's face like a sunset reversed. Daniel turned to Jessica with a question in his eyes, but she spoke before he could ask it. "He doesn't mean anything," she said quickly, too quickly, her voice cracking just at the edges. "This is some mistake. He's not supposed to be here. He's just an ex, from college, someone I dated for a few months before I met you." Ryan didn't correct her. He didn't need to. The weight of omission was heavier than any accusation could have been. Jessica's voice rose a little higher, that familiar pitch she used when she felt her control slipping. "Emily invited him, obviously," she said, turning toward me with a glare that could have cut through steel, if it weren't so thinly veiled in desperation. "She's been trying to ruin this from the beginning." I stood then slowly, calmly, and walked toward her, not to gloat, not to yell, but to finish what I started. When I stopped just a few feet away, I looked at her, not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with something colder. The quiet certainty of someone who has finally given up expecting honesty from a habitual liar. I pulled the folded note from my pocket, the one with her handwriting, the one she thought was gone, and placed it on the nearest table without a word. Ryan glanced at it but didn't touch it. Daniel didn't even look away from Jessica. "No speeches," I said finally, my voice low and even. "That's what you asked for, right?" I took a step back, turned away from the room, and walked toward the doors. As I moved, the music slowly began again. Some nervous DJ trying to patch over the tear in the night with a gentle instrumental. The audio equivalent of sweeping glass under the rug. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I stood for a while in the gravel lot, watching the wind toss bits of confetti across the asphalt like failed celebrations. I wasn't angry, I wasn't proud, I was simply done. Done with the role they'd written for me, done with being the problem child, the broken daughter, the scapegoat who soaked up the shame so everyone else could shine a little brighter. Let them figure out who they were without me propping up the lie. Ryan came out a few minutes later, walking slowly with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, like he wasn't sure if he should say something or just keep going. When he reached me, he stopped, looked at the car I was standing beside, and then back at me. "You didn't have to do it like that," he said, not accusing, not judging, just observing. I nodded. "No, but if I hadn't, she never would have stopped." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you think you won?" I looked back at the glowing hall behind us, where the party continued like a machine grinding forward, despite missing parts. "I don't think there was anything to win," I said finally. "But I didn't lose. That's enough." He opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. And after a quiet moment of shared understanding, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, then climbed into my rental car, the uniform stiff against the seat, but somehow more comfortable than anything else I had worn in that house in years. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine idle, watching the silhouettes of people behind the curtained windows continue to drink and dance and pretend. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just pulled out of the lot slowly, leaving behind the music, the flowers, the chandeliers, and the ruins of someone else's white lie. And as I drove down that familiar road, past the oak trees and weather-worn fences of the neighborhood where I'd spent my entire life being half seen, half heard, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't running away from them. I was simply going somewhere else. Somewhere I chose. Somewhere honest. Whatever came next, it would be mine. And that, for once, felt like a kind of freedom they could never take back.